we go. All right, we have some folks joining us. We'll wait a little bit while we let people in. Good morning to everyone who's joining us. I'm saying good morning. You may be joining from a different time zone, and sorry, that's the I'm on the East Coast, so that's why I say good morning. All right. Well, as people continue to join, we will get started. Greetings and welcome to all of you for joining us for the official kickoff of the Mastery Transcript Consortium's Fall Friday Symposium. This is College in Context, this particular session. My name is Susie Bell, and I'm the Senior Director of Member Engagement for the MTC. The Mastery Transcript Consortium, MTC, is a growing network of schools throughout the United States and around the world who are introducing a digital high school transcript that opens up opportunity for each and every student from all backgrounds, locations, and types of schools to have their unique strengths, abilities, interests, and histories fostered, understood, and celebrated. As a very young organization, together with our member schools, we celebrated the first pioneering students delivering Mastery transcripts to admissions offices as they applied to college in the fall of 2019. During 2019-2020, students from MTC member schools earned 85 offers of admission from 60 colleges from across the US. This year, we will more than triple the number of MTC member schools and students using the Mastery transcript to reflect their learning, and hundreds of students will use it as they apply to college or enter the workforce. Our membership includes a wide range of educational institutions: public, independent, international, micro schools, homeschool, schools within schools, colleges, large public districts, and state-level networks of public schools. We're delighted to host this conversation for our member schools, our advisory council and board of directors, and other interested schools and organizations today. Leading today's College in Context conversation in a fireside chat format are Stacy Caldwell, CEO of MTC, and Dr. Angel Perez, CEO of the National Association for College Admission Counseling, or NACAC. Before introducing Stacy and Angel, I'll review a few important logistics about the webinar format. Only the speakers today will be featured via video. Participants will be muted. There are two ways to engage during the webinar: through the Q&A and through chat. If you would like to ask a question of Angel or Stacy, please use the Q&A feature to pose your question. If you see a question posed that you would like answered, you can upvote that question in the Q&A. We'll do our best in the time we have to address as many questions as possible. With around 150 people joining today, we may not get to all those questions. We'll reserve the chat feature for leaving comments or questions for participants, and only questions posed in the Q&A space will be addressed by Angel and Stacy. We'd love to know more about who's joining us today, so feel free to use the chat now to introduce yourself and why this particular topic interests you and how it intersects with your work. All right, with those logistics behind us, let me introduce Stacy Caldwell. Before joining the MTC as Chief Executive Officer, Stacy has served as Chief Product Officer for the Princeton Review, where she was responsible for the company's ongoing innovation and development of education solutions for individuals, high schools, and colleges. Prior to her work with the Princeton Review, Caldwell served as Vice President for the SAT suite of assessments, playing the lead role during the most recent redesign of the SAT. Her previous roles include business and instructional technology positions at SCORE Educational Centers and Kaplan Test Prep, and admissions and consulting roles at Bain & Company and Arthur Andersen. Stacy brings to the MTC a deep understanding of innovative education models, as well as the dynamics at the intersection between preparation for college and college admissions. I'm also very pleased to introduce Dr. Angel Perez, CEO of NACAC. Dr. Angel Perez is CEO of the National Association of College Admission Counseling. In this role, he represents nearly 14,000 admission and counseling professionals worldwide committed to post-secondary access and success. He is the primary voice of the association to government, media, and global partners. Perez is recognized as a national thought leader and is a sought after speaker on issues of educational equity, access, and success in American education. Prior to his arrival at NACAC, he served for 22 years as a leader in higher education, where his work was described as transformative. He most recently served as Vice President for Enrollment and Student Success at Trinity College in Connecticut, where he also taught in the Educational Studies Department. Angel is passionate about public policy as a platform for change. During his tenure in higher ed, the governor of Connecticut appointed him to the New England Board of Higher Education, and he was chosen by the Gates Foundation to serve on Forward 50, a group of leaders representing higher ed solutions to Congress. In 2019, a Forbes article named him the greatest influencer in college admission. Dr. Perez's work has been featured in many media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and CBS Evening News. And now, Stacy Caldwell.
Thank you so much, Susie. And let me just add my huge thanks and appreciation, Angel, for you joining us this morning. Really, really looking forward to this conversation, as I know our members are as well. And wow, what a time to be having this conversation.
What a time, yes. And
Indeed.
thank you for having me, Stacy. I'm excited to be here. I'm a fan of MTC, as you know.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So I'd love to start sort of big picture. I mean, you know, we presently find ourselves in a world that is shifting and often challenging amid twin pandemics of a virus that spares, frankly, not even the most powerful among us, and a movement for racial justice that reminds us that each one of us matters in making the world a better place. And clearly we believe, and I know you believe, that education is and always been at the heart of the solution. It's how we best support every young person in moving their lives and their work forward. And in addressing many of the complex global issues. So in this moment, it feels like there is a possibility or a moment of hope, that it's a time for opening up a case for new learning models, new ways of knowing what students know, and a more holistic approach to college admissions. But, you know, frankly, we all recognize that college admissions also faces massive uncertainties. We're sort of joking. I think one of the times that I chatted with you and with a number of higher ed folks back in January, February, we were all talking about the judicial rulings and some of the changes to some of the NACAC agreements that folks had and what that was going to do in the great uncertainty in college admissions. And then the spring happened. And, you know, in the US alone, 55 million students and 144,000 schools saw schools either move online or get canceled. A lot of rising seniors had no opportunity to take either the SAT or the ACT. And many had changes to the way their grades are happening. So in that context, and in a context where we still have almost 50% of students attending school virtually, like, I guess the broad question here is just what's on your mind? You're in this new position. How are you thinking about the world? What are the big topics that you're really thinking about right now?
Yeah, thank you. No pressure on the big picture question here. What's on my mind? I think it depends on the story of the day, right? I mean, you and I were just talking offline that, you know, we woke up to some interesting news this morning, and I just feel like I can't keep up with the news cycle. So, you know, it is interesting that, you know, the world, particularly in education, has moved so quickly as a result of COVID. And the way that I'm sort of thinking about it, because I am an optimist despite all of the challenges that we have before us, is really thinking about how do we use this crisis as an opportunity to really expand educational access, to think differently about how to evaluate students, to think differently about what it means to be ready for institutions of higher education. As you mentioned, I spent 22 years on college campuses, and I was one of those sort of, I guess, reluctant admissions people. I was in admissions for a long time, but also was a big critic of the system. And the fact that, you know, having worked at test optional institutions, having worked at institutions where I implemented character as one of the pieces of the evaluation process, which at the time was a bit atypical. It's a growing movement now, that I really feel like there's a different way that we could be evaluating students for success in college that could open the door a little bit wider. So I'm thinking about a few things. One is how do, in this current role that I sit, we're leading an association of 14,000 people that are either in high schools or on campuses doing the really difficult work. Their world has been transformed. The way they have to deliver their services are extraordinarily different. So, I wake up every day thinking about how I might be able to make their lives easier through the services that we provide and the training and the support. And at the same time, also thinking deeply about how we do advocacy on the national level. So for example, most people on the call probably know that many colleges have gone test optional this year. And I got an interesting, this is an example of how we advocate. I got an interesting couple of calls from high school counselors this summer saying it's wonderful that all these schools are going test optional, but my families don't believe it because the SAT is so deeply ingrained in American society, right? That students still feel like they would be disadvantaged. So, at the National Association, we created a campaign called Test Optional Means Test Optional, and asked colleges and universities to sign on to that so that high school counselors could share that with families and say, if these institutions signed on to this petition, they are saying that they are not going to penalize you for not having standardized tests. We've also worked with state systems, for example, this summer to, a lot of people don't know that actually places like Georgia, Colorado, Florida, in order to go test optional, you have to go through the legislature, right? And so we worked within political systems and advocacy roles in order to help those states move in that direction. So I'm thinking deeply about that. And then the other thing that I'm thinking deeply about, which many MTC members can relate to, I think is, again, how do we reimagine the admissions process? How do we use this moment in time in our history to think differently about what we require of students? One thing that I'm particularly passionate about is simplification of the process. I mean, I think our process is quite cumbersome, and there's a lot of data that shows, particularly around financial aid, that a lot of students don't complete the process because it's so complex. If you've ever had the misfortune of filling out a FAFSA, it is really a soul-sucking experience of over 100 questions, right? And so how do we sort of simplify this process so we can open the doors a little bit wider as well? And then I think the last thing I'll mention, because I feel so passionate about it, is really this is also a great opportunity for the entire country to stop and think about how do we fund higher education in this country? How do we fund public school systems so that we can create more access into the pipeline to higher education? It's very interesting to me, when the pandemic hit in March, I was still on a college campus and I was on calls with state legislators in Connecticut who really didn't realize that institutions were so tuition dependent because of a lack of funding from states and federal government, right? So how do we restore this notion in America that higher education is a public good, that we need to invest in higher education? Obviously, given the time that we are in right now, we're about to go into election. I think people need to vote, but also that at their local level really vote for more funding in these areas. So those are kind of the big picture issues that I'll be working on behind the scenes at NACAC.
Well, so that is a fabulous list. Thank you for sharing all of that. And there's plenty for us to dig into. So I think the big issues around the opportunity to think differently around admissions, the sort of twin issues of equity and funding, which I think are really big fundamental issues. And I love this push for simplification, because we know that, we all know that sometimes it's the silly little small hurdles that hold back opportunity. And the more we can do collectively to get rid of those hurdles, the better off students are. I'd love to actually take a minute though and just dive into one piece. I mean, so I love the Test Optional Means Test Optional campaign, and really appreciate that you all are pushing that, and that there's a bigger voice, because we often get asked a bunch of questions, because as we're talking with a range of college admissions officers, and the thing that I am constantly trying to communicate to folks is, these are folks who have students' best interests in mind. They are working hard to try to make sure they are seeing the best picture of the student. And if they are saying test optional, they are truly going to be test optional. And so, we try to get that message across. I love that you're getting the message across, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts. I mean, this idea of, can people trust what colleges are telling them, or will they listen to what colleges are telling them about policies, underlines a lot of the other things that we're talking about in terms of simplification of the process and opening things up and opening up additional opportunity. So just, do you have any thoughts just from what you've heard, given your sort of national stage and platform, on what's behind that, and what, if anything, we all can be collectively doing to start to build or rebuild a little more trust around the, hey, when we say something, we mean it, and we have students' best interests at mind?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I have given this a little bit of thought, because I am really surprised, not only from NACAC members who are in schools who are telling me that this is happening as they talk to families, but I have friends with children who are 17 years old. I actually was on Facebook the other night with a friend of mine in California who really was trying to convince me that she should drive to Utah to have her child take the SAT, even though she's very nervous about that due to COVID and all of that, because despite what I said to her, she just felt like, well, but she's applying to X school and it's so selective, which means they're going to disadvantage her if she didn't have a test. So really the struggle is real on the messaging front. And I think it comes from a variety of places. One is something I mentioned earlier, which is, the testing is so institutionalized in this country that, the word SAT and ACT go hand in hand with college admissions, right? And so for parents to unravel that or even not include it, there is a great sense of skepticism and anxiety around it. I think the other piece is that people forget that we just came out of a varsity blues scandal. So college admissions has not had the best media over the past several years. And, while I think most of that story has sort of died down, the American public is still thinking deeply about it. And I think abroad as well. I see that we have folks here from France and China. I was looking in the chat box. Lovely to have folks, international folks here. But I think that has created a deep mistrust. And one of the things that's frustrating for me about that is one, that it's called a college admissions scandal. There has not been one admissions officer indicted or accused in any of the stories, right? That really, this was athletics, this was parents, this was development offices. And so, admissions ended up getting a bad rap around it. But, the other pieces, I think, is that genuine passion that families have. I always try to take it back to the families, that I think in the end, just parents want to do right by their children, right? And so they don't want to do anything to disadvantage their children in the process. So I think what we could be doing as educators is really, all speaking the same tune and all reiterating this over and over again. I will say that I think it may take one cycle, like this academic year, for this current senior class to cycle through and see that, they still got into schools and that it wasn't the end of the world to not have the testing. And I also think that it's going to depend, the future is going to depend on whether or not those institutions go back to requiring the test, or if they come up with other creative ways of thinking about evaluation.
Right. Well, and I think that, so let's use that to tee into the opportunity of how admissions could look a lot different post this year. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things about this year and the number of schools that have gone test optional and test blind, frankly, in the face of students not having the test. And also, let's remember, a lot of these students will have now 1+ semesters where their grading looks very different than what they expected it to look like. And so, from our perspective, we are hearing folks talk about, well, from my perspective, what that is a big old forced experiment, right? Colleges are going to be forced to look at different pieces of data than the ones that they have most traditionally relied on, and certainly most traditionally relied on in terms of their, sort of predictive validity and the way that they think about their research. So I guess I'm curious, again, from your perspective, but flipping to the, what you're hearing from the colleges, this seems like such an opportunity for people to dive in and experiment and try to find the actual more authentic, real pieces of information that they can use consistently and well. And I'm just sort of curious what you're hearing from folks as they go into this year and are thinking about new variables, new pieces of information that they can glean from student applications. How are they approaching that?
Yeah, what's interesting is that it's all in development right now. And I think
Right,
this is
right.
a difficult year to be a college counselor, by the way. So all my college counseling friends, I have deep empathy for you on this webinar right now. Because the reality, what I am hearing is little tidbits here and there about how institutions are reinventing their process. But because it's happening right now, I call it, they're building the plane as they're flying it, right? And so
Right.
to a certain extent, we have to give them a little breathing room to do that. But I think it causes obviously a lot of anxiety because counselors have been pretty good at trying to predict what are the things that institutions actually care deeply about. The things I'm sort of hearing, and these are anecdotal, I don't have data around it, but the conversations I've been having with chief enrollment officers around the country have a lot to do with the fact that this year they are going to be paying a lot more attention to narrative. They are really going to be paying a lot closer attention to the storytelling, whether that's through an essay, whether that's through sort of virtual interviews that are happening in platforms like this. I've been saying to students, this is the year, here are the things you can control. You can't control how selective an institution is going to be or what priorities change behind the scenes, but you can control what story you decide to tell, what question you decide to answer on the application, and sort of how you create your own narrative. So I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis on that. Some institutions are dipping their toes, into starting to use character in evaluation. It's something that I've done at institutions in the past. And I know that organizations like the Character Collaborative, for example, are working deeply on this and are working with institutions to show them how to do that. And what that means is that, really giving students official credit in the application for characteristics that predict success in college. So that research actually shows predict success. So things like grit and perseverance and being comfortable in a minority of one and creativity and innovation. So actually giving students credit for that. Now, the hard part about that is, admission officers are always under such pressure to produce data. Having worked for presidents and boards, I can tell you, they don't love the fluffy stuff, they want the data. That's why SATs are so easy, right? I can tell you if my class got stronger because the score went up.
And the simpler the number, the easier it is to take in and understand.
Easier it is, yes. And this sort of does go into a different category, but I will tell you, I'm quite passionate about it because having worked at an institution for 5 years where we implemented this, the result of that was truly more engagement on the classroom. And for me, success looked like when faculty came to me and said, these are the most interesting students I have ever taught in my life, right? That because we paid so much attention to that character piece, that it really transformed an entire community. So I have heard that institutions are paying close attention to that and thinking about how they actually dip their toes in and maybe start using it. And then the other piece that's changing a little bit is, remember that in the application, students usually by their senior year had in their co-curricular list, right? I was the president of X, or I played on this club, and many students won't have that. And so, and that is okay, by the way. I think it's important to let students know colleges don't expect you to have that. But, they will still have information about 9th, 10th, and 11th and expect students to fill out what they were doing pre-COVID. And to also tell their stories. I think they're going to be paying close attention to what did students use their time with during COVID. So for example, I can see, many students may be telling stories about the fact that they were helping their younger siblings do online learning, or that they figured out a way how to volunteer online. So I think, the common theme I'm hearing is a much bigger emphasis on storytelling.
Right. Love to just sort of use that to transition into a couple pieces of advice for our high schools. So I think that emphasis on storytelling is sort of one, right? So, but I'm curious, I mean, a couple things that we hear is the student story and the school story, right? So one of the pieces of feedback that we often get from colleges is they really actually want to understand, and this is from the more holistic admissions folks, they really want to understand the story of the school, what the school is doing, and that is, and they don't always pick that up from the school profile. So, if you were giving advice to high schools in terms of telling the story of their school, what would you suggest they do to really make that picture of what the school is doing pop for colleges?
You know, it's interesting because I've always felt that high schools have a responsibility to market as much as universities do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the high school profile is one of those ways to do that. And I will admit, many schools do not have the luxury
Sure.
or the resource to actually
Mm-hmm.
reach out individually to colleges. But I did see that the kind of marketing throughout my career as an admissions
Mm-hmm.
officer that high schools actually made as really, really helpful, right? I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
got to know a lot of college counselors directly, or I would get letters from heads of schools to say, you know, want you to know that our curriculum is moving in this direction. I think
Mm-hmm.
the biggest misconception out there, particularly with parents and families, is that admissions officers make a value judgment about the curriculum that a high school chooses. We are dealing with
Mm-hmm.
thousands of curricula across the world. And so,
Mm-hmm.
no, we make no value judgment. What we wanted to
Mm-hmm.
know was, what is it that you've decided, right? Like, and what does this particular course mean?
Mm-hmm.
The high school profile was always a window into that, but not always.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, you know, a simplification, whether it's of the high school profile or of the communications that you are sending to colleges and universities, is also really important. Small bites, snippets, not very long narratives, because they are reading
Mm-hmm.
thousands and thousands of applications. But
Mm-hmm.
you know, even after 22 years in admissions, I was sort of dumbstruck by how often I read a file where there were courses or curriculum that were not clearly explained to me, right? And that there was almost
Mm-hmm.
this assumption that I would understand the local context of those
Mm-hmm.
schools.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say there are a couple of things. Relationship development is key. So the more that you can develop relationships with the person who reads the files of your institution, very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
You know, obviously the profile plays a role.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a fan of simplification in general. So I would say the
Yeah.
profile as well,
Mm-hmm.
simplification, but also, you know, constant communication with the institution every time you make
Mm-hmm.
changes to your curriculum or
Mm-hmm.
even courses, because I find
Mm-hmm.
that there are some institutions where the same admissions officer has been reading from that particular high school for 15, 20 years, right? So as
Mm-hmm.
changes are made, making sure that you
Mm-hmm.
keep those individuals up to date. But I know high schools aren't used to the marketing piece as much as higher
Yeah.
ed is. But I
Mm-hmm.
do feel that high schools have a responsibility to market their institutions as much as higher ed does.
For sure. And I think that's especially important for schools like the members of the Mastery Transcript Consortium, where they are doing really interesting transformational work and changing how high school happens. And so I think, you know, we continue to work with our members to make sure they are all telling that story, because oftentimes when you're in the middle of the work, you're doing amazing transformations and you forget that if you're not in the middle of the work, you know, folks don't quite recognize what's going on. And so I think that's, I do think that that is super important. And then I'm also taking, I love your simplification, and I think there's a great opportunity in the fact that folks are leaning into the narrative more. And so, you know, I'm sort of hearing in the coaching of students, thinking hard about the narrative, thinking hard about the sort of your experience, your story, the big accomplishments, and telling that in a sort of, in a simple way that can quickly resonate for admissions officers. Is that sort of a fair way to summarize the coaching for students? Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, you know, I guess I'll share the story of my favorite essay last year. It was about a
That's great.
student who worked at a coffee shop in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
Not an extraordinary experience, if you will. I think there's a stereotype out there that students have to have some extraordinary experience and write
Yeah.
about it in order to get into college. But the reason that essay was so successful is it was written in pretty simple language. It felt like it was a 17-year-old that was writing it.
Mm-hmm.
And two, the student told me what he learned about. And at the end, he talked a little bit about the fact that by the end of the summer, he really was grappling with how invisible people in the customer service industry are. That, you know, people would order coffee and like not even look at him, like look right through him. And there was a learning moment there for him. Beautifully written, very simple. Here's a day in my life and what I learned about it, right? And so I think that the more that students can focus on that and not feel like colleges are expecting this superhero story, because we're not. And I read a lot of superhero stories when I was an admissions officer, but I still went back to the most exciting essays for me were the ones that took me into a typical day in a student's life and were written in the voice of a 17-year-old.
And those authentic moments of self-reflection, a 17-year-old that's like having a realization. Yeah, that's a really, that's a really, yeah, that's a great insight. Thank you. You know, I do want to, I am curious about your advice for the MTC, but before we go there, I'd like to shift for a moment to this question of equity. And you also brought up the issue of funding and simplification of processes, which I think is very related. But I think, you know, one of the things that this pandemic has really brought home to us is the ongoing state of inequities in the United States. And it's, you know, we are exacerbating current inequities, we are adding new inequities. You know, some of the data that I found as I was looking at this, you know, we frankly thought the digital divide is almost a passé term, right? Like it's something that we're like, oh, we've solved that. There is no more digital divide, until all of a sudden every student needs to be able to do their work virtually and online. And what we found is that, you know, so what some of the data over the last few months has found is that when you look at this, we still have 35% of households with that have students in the 6 to 17 age range that have family incomes under $30,000 with no high-speed internet. So 35% of those houses have no high-speed internet versus 6% for families at the over 75K range. 1 in 4 of students in those households lack access to a computer. And we could quote a lot of data around some of the online platforms have showed what, you know, sort of the variations in students consistently getting online from high income versus low income students. So there is a range of inequities here that we are faced with, and there is a risk that that moving to virtual education just, you know, further exacerbates and further sort of widens the gap in terms of student opportunity, the ongoing to their ongoing career readiness, their ongoing education, et cetera. And so, you know, with that as backdrop, I guess I'm just sort of curious, maybe we start with like how you think admissions officers are thinking in the context of that, and then maybe we can transition into some of the broader policy work around simplification, around funding that, you know, that you're leaning into, that we can all support and lean into as well.
Yeah, I think it's an issue that you know, admissions officers were thinking about, but obviously during COVID, it really, you know, just became exacerbated. And to be honest, I did a lot of thinking about that this summer, because one of the things that NACAC did is that we used to run college fairs all over the country and throughout Canada. Obviously could not do that. Bringing together 7,000 17-year-olds at the Jacob Javits Center in New York was no longer going to be an option. So we pivoted and we did this event online. We had 30,000 students register for these events, and 22,000 actually show up, which was impressive. But at the same time, we thought deeply about who are we missing? In some ways, you know, going online has democratized things a bit. I mean, I got a beautiful note from a student in Iowa who said, "Thank you for hosting these fairs, because the schools that I saw on the virtual fair never came to my high school." And I have held on to that email to remind myself of why the work matters, and why we might actually use this moment in our history to rethink how we actually reach out to students. But at the same time, for every single one of those students in Iowa that wrote me are the 35%, right, that you were talking about, that do not have access. And so I think one of the things that admissions officers are realizing is that while they realize that, you know, the COVID pandemic has really pushed them to use technology a lot more and to offer most of their things online, it actually also made them realize that they can't do away with the in-person, the boots on the ground, the recruitment, the kinds of things that visiting those high schools that have no resources, because they realize that that might actually be the only opportunity for students to engage. But I do think it's a really difficult issue that, frankly, most of us don't know exactly how to solve.
For sure. I mean, I think the work that you did at Trinity to use every bit of Trinity's resources to try to pull in additional students that to sort of greater diversity, more low-income students, students from a full range of backgrounds, I think is really interesting. And I'm curious, like, the degree to which you see part of NACAC's role as pushing for some of that or supporting that work, versus some of the other things that you've been talking about as well, the policies around like simplifying the FAFSA, those sorts of things, your sort of role as an influencer in those areas.
Yeah, we just released a report called Roadmap for Change, and if you Google Roadmap for Change in NACAC, it will come up, and it really sort of stating a position that we are going to be moving the association towards, which is huge advocacy at the federal as well as state levels around funding. And I wrote this in an op-ed recently, and it sort of captures how I have felt for 22 years as an enrollment officer, that the media likes to sort of blame colleges for the number of students they don't admit or the lack of diversity. And sure, colleges have a huge responsibility there, but the reality of the matter is the tools that admissions officers are given are deeply flawed. And one of them, and many folks probably read the New York Times article where I was featured around the work that we did at Trinity in trying to change a 100-plus-year-old institution to really become much more diverse. Finances came into play so much in that, right? Most people, most of the public believes, well, you should just take more students and you should just take more low-income students, but it is not as easy as that. This is an old data point, but I'll share it anyway. When I was at Trinity, 3% of my financial aid budget came from the federal government, 0.03% came from the state of Connecticut. So not only was I giving out the financial aid, it was only being subsidized by 3%, right? That is not a recipe for financial success for an institution. And so, one of the things that I feel really strongly about is that we need to work as a nation entirely together to think about how we fund higher education differently. There is a history here. In the 1960s, Ronald Reagan got up during a State of the State address and said that the state of California will no longer subsidize intellectual curiosity. And a week later, the California system, which was free back then, created the tuition model, and we have never come back from that, right? Like the kind of subsidies. And so for me, I think if we're all going to be successful, we need to figure out a way to subsidize students more and subsidize higher ed more.
Right. Yeah. I'm so glad you brought up that California example, because I think, after reading the New York Times article, some of the other things over the, last fall and going into the winter, I mean, one of my deep frustrations is that we're just failing to have the public funding conversation. In all too many states, we've spent years and years and years, like frankly, back to the last recession, cutting funding for public education and cutting funding for financial aid for all institutions. And we've never recovered that. And yet that's not a piece of the conversation. And I think, so I really appreciate you highlighting that. And I think, we need to continue to focus on that for sure. Because without that, it's just, there are some real constraints, and colleges face real constraints around their ongoing viability that, that everybody needs to work within. I think you did a particularly good job of maximizing within that in Trinity. And so I'd love to see everybody continue to do that work, but I think there is a much bigger conversation here.
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about the simplification stuff that you mentioned. So you mentioned FAFSA, there's like, what are the other levers that you see as sort of big simplification pushes that can help, sort of systemically support some of the equity issues that we're seeing right now?
Yeah, so there's FAFSA for sure, and I've been talking to my colleagues at the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. We do have a few projects forthcoming, can't talk about them yet, but that we're going to be working together, because we do realize that you can't talk about the admissions application without talking about financial aid, particularly for most students in this country. But I think around the admissions process, I do believe that this movement towards test optional is giving us an opportunity to think about, what are the variables that we actually need to be able to predict success in college? If my job as an admissions officer on a campus is to predict whether or not a student is going to be successful here, what are the tools that I need? And so I think the simplification would look a little bit different in the sense that perhaps, the testing goes away. We'll see how that works out. We do see a test blind movement softly emerging. But also, you know, I would love every institution, and this may be one of the recommendations that comes out of some of the work that we do, you know, how many essays do you actually need from a student, right? You have like for those on the common application, like you have a common application essay, and then, you know, these schools want 3 supplements. And I mean, it's just so over the top. And in my career, I just felt like every year we kept adding. You know, like a couple of admissions officers would get together over the summer and huddle in a room and come up with this great idea of yet another thing to add to the application, not really realizing the implications that that has on students and the amount of time and work that has to go into that. And so, you know, I would love for every institution to be able to do a deep dive into their own requirements, since they're so different across the country, particularly state systems, and think about what is the pure data points that we actually need, and really try another piece of that roadmap that I was talking about that we're sort of going after, because given that NACAC can no longer enforce an ethical code because of a Department of Justice investigation, which we could have a whole other webinar about, we understand we can't do that, but what we can do is advocacy. And the biggest thing that we're focusing on is how do you put students at the very center of every decision you make, right? And so, you know, I would like to have NACAC lead the conversation around, if we were to start this all over again, right? If we were to say we're just gonna blow up the system and start again, what would that look like? And so we're hoping to have that conversation starting this year, and using sort of COVID as an opportunity to just think really, really differently moving forward.
Right. And that is also, so I love that. And I love that conversation. And I agree. I think many students feel that, right? That the escalation of the number of essays or the range of things that they're putting in, it's almost, you know, it's sort of trial by compliance, right? So if you're willing to do this much work, then you must be committed to my university, which is just not, you know, there are a lot of other ways to get at that for sure.
Well, and I will say, Stacy, not to cut you off, but you know, I have deep empathy for my colleagues in higher education, because, and this is one of the reasons why I'm passionate about bringing different sectors into the conversation, until other things that feed into higher education change.
Right.
It is going to be very difficult to make massive changes. So for example, US News and World Report, right? Until that formula changes and what institutions are rewarded for, there may be some difficult conversations ahead, because presidents and trustees of universities may not be willing to make those kinds of sacrifices. One of my least favorite conversations every year as an enrollment officer was with the CFO and Moody's bond rating. Moody's bond rating actually looks at admission statistics, right?
I know.
And I will never forget a conversation that I had when I was at the Claremont colleges, and I think we had like 50 fewer applications that year. I mean, 50, which in the context of thousands means nothing. And the person at Moody's bond rating said to me, "Are you losing market position?" And really was thinking about downgrading us over that, right? And so the system incentivizes institutions to do things that really from their own ethical student-centered perspective is not what they want to do, but they realize that they are going to have to be penalized if they make some of these changes. So it's really, really complicated.
For sure. And I think and it's complicated at both that systemic level that you just mentioned. And I think those are really, US News and the Moody's ratings are 2 really big ones. And, you know, hopefully we can get some movement and traction on that, because again, opportunity for some different variables this year. But then I think I also resonate with the point around, you know, part of the reason for all of the essays is folks are looking for a way to get all those additional pieces of information from students and get them somewhat consistently, right? So, you know, there is no other way for some folks to evaluate character traits or where students had a really outstanding experience, because those aren't contained in the traditional transcript, test score, you know, sort of core of the application. So, you know, obviously we think we sit with one of the really good solutions for this. So I'd love to turn to like asking your advice for us, and then Susie, after that we'll look to see if we've got any questions online that we can answer as well. But you know, given that our member high schools are really trying to address that last issue, right? So what we're really trying to do is say, hey, let's clearly define what students need to do over the course of high school. So we're doing that, each high school is doing that in the form of mastery credits and being really clear about what those are, and including the full range of social, emotional, cross-disciplinary application of skills, et cetera. And then they're saying, let's communicate whether or not students have achieved that and show the work that they did, actually put the student work in context. And so, you know, we recognize this as a really big shift, but part of what we're trying to do is say, hey, we'll both show you the skills and we'll show you the student work in context. And from that, you can get a much richer picture of the student, and you can do it without the student having to then write 7 essays to the side, right? It's the student authentically presenting the real work that they did over their 4 years of high school. So given that that work seems even more strongly important in the moment that we're in right now, I guess I'd just love your thoughts on, as we continue to help colleges navigate this transition and navigate from the proxies that they've been using, which is, hey, I know a certain course means certain things to my faculty, to, hey, I've got this set of skills that I need to interpret and use, and I've got this set of student work that I need to interpret and use. Advice or thoughts for us as we continue to navigate that transition with colleges? We feel like we had a good first year, but you know, obviously as we continue to expand, we want to have that conversation in deeper and richer ways.
Yeah, so 2 things sort of come to mind as you were speaking, Stacy. One is that I love the idea of the potential of the work that MTC schools are doing to actually simplify the process, right? I mean, if you think about it, students, they've already proven themselves at their high schools. They already have the work, but then you create a different process for which they're rewarded in the admissions process. Could we take some of that content and give it to colleges and universities and allow them to make their own sort of decisions? There are some issues there around, you know, how much time does it take to read a file and all of that, but colleges and universities have been reading schools with narratives and no grades for a long time. So this wouldn't be new to a certain extent. So that actually, I'm going to file that in the back of my head as I continue to think about simplicity. But the other piece that I think is really important, and this was my biggest lesson working in higher education, you got to bring higher ed faculty along. And so the pressure that oftentimes admission officers feel is really the pressure and apologies to any faculty friends who are on, but antiquated ways of thinking with my higher education faculty colleagues. And so the more that MTC could get in front of faculty, whether that's at individual institutions, presenting at their conferences, because, you know, faculty often get involved in conversations about the kinds of credits that students are going to receive if they take AP or IB, for example. But I think really it's going to take a bit of a national paradigm shift. But what I have found successful in trying to make real deep systemic change in institutions of higher education has been always leading with the faculty and bringing them along. Because if they understand what the high schools are doing, respect it, and then they like the students that are showing up at their classrooms, it's pretty easy to change the paradigm.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it was sort of interesting to us how many, there's some wide variance there. I mean, there's folks who work constantly with their faculty, and then we saw, you know, in our conversations and surveys this last fall, we also, you know, we heard from quite a few folks who don't work with faculty at all. So I think that's a really, really cogent piece of advice for folks, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for answering all of my questions.
Sure.
In the meantime, the folks participating in the conference here have been teeing up a number of questions, and Susie has been working to summarize some of them for me. So, so let me take a cut at sort of grouping a couple things here. So one, maybe relatively straightforward. People are wondering if there's a document that summarizes research results, like characteristics valued by college faculty, or any research about how ready colleges are to deal with alternative transcripts, or, you know, anything that you can point to that's sort of data that folks can look at. Anything you'd point us towards?
Yeah, you know, it's actually funny enough, I was talking to a School of Education dean recently in Vermont, basically saying, like, this area is ripe for studying because folks are really dipping their toes into it right now, but there's really not a lot of research. I will say that when I started to do this at my previous institution, where I actually started, again, because I had a couple of goals. One was to learn from faculty, but also to bring them along, is what I actually did was I worked with faculty in different areas of the institution who had expertise around some of these characteristics that predict success. And so, for example, I will tell you that you probably have folks in your neuroscience department, in your psychology department, behavioral sciences, that if you talk about an interest in moving in this area, they also might be able to point you to some research. But I don't have anything, one big study that I can point to right now.
Okay, great, thank you. We also have a set of questions that dig into this intersection of character traits and equity. And I know and I'd love your perspective on this, given your experience implementing this. So a couple things, one question is, how do we ensure that character is not code-based in a white Eurocentric narrative? I think good question. Similarly, a couple comments about grit is a problematic construction. And how do we figure out a way for humans to not act on implicit bias about matters such as character traits? And I think that's where I see a lot of the conversation, even with the character collaborative coming in. So how do you both look at character, but make sure that doesn't become a tool that that worsens inequities as opposed to strengthens the opportunity for equity?
Yeah, I think it's a great question and a great point. Something I talked a lot about when I was on campuses, but also, to a certain extent, it's interesting because my experience, at least in the 5 years where I was using character-based evaluation in admission, is that it actually, and part of this came through deep training, a lot of anti-bias training on behalf of your staff, but a lot of it actually helped low-income first-generation students, underrepresented students in higher education, actually help their files to a certain extent. And the reason for that is we had a lot of training where, and actually we took that training and not just used it in admissions, but also used it on the student success side of the house when we were doing first-generation orientations, where we actually said to students, you actually already have the skills to succeed here. College is a skill to be learned. A lot of our students who had overcome a lot of things, and so obviously had like adversity, or I know grit is a tricky term, but those kinds of characteristics that they brought with them. What we actually did in the admissions process is give them credit for that, because we realized if they had actually overcome a bunch of these different things in their life, they actually already had the strength and the tools to succeed in college. We just needed to teach them the culture of college, right? And so to a certain extent, it can actually be quite advantageous for disadvantaged populations, but you cannot do it and implement it into your process without deep anti-bias training with your admission officers and constant retooling of that. So it does take an investment in admission offices.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Let's see. We have one about research. Might NACAC be interested in helping find funders for research around the question that you asked around what variables do we actually need to predict student success at college? And I know colleges in their institutional research do a lot of that work, but I think it's an interesting idea of, is there a more global set of research that should be done around this? And so I'm just sort of curious do you think that's a NACAC role? Do you think that's there are other folks who should be doing that work?
No, I think it could be a NACAC role as the conversation happens around simplification of the process and thinking differently about what we need in order to make decisions about college success. And so am I interested? Absolutely. I think that would be really, really interesting. And I also know, having now been at the table with foundations, that there is a lot of interest around this. There's a lot of interest around thinking differently about evaluation. So reach out to me, ceo@nacacnet.org. That is my email.
That's great, thank you. We won't be able to get to all of the questions, but I'll end with this one. So, so many of our schools are you know, they are doing great work communicating with students and parents, but, you know, are oftentimes looking for help in that conversation. And, you know, sort of you pointed out things like US News and World Report and other things, like there are lots of influences and lots of information that people pick up around this. And so the question is there a role for NACAC in educating parents so they are less resistant to change, such as the MTC? And relatedly, we've been thrown into a situation that really catalyzes change. So do you think the opportunity is fleeting in this year and next year to push on that issue?
Yeah, I do. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I just went on a listening tour this summer when I joined the organization. And one of the things that it sounds like members are really interested in is NACAC being a more of a go-to source, a trusted source for students and families. That, you know, there's so much confusion around the process. You know, is there a way where NACAC could become that trusted hub where if I have a question about college admission, or if I doubt whether or not this thing that I'm hearing about college admissions is true, you know, I think we have a role to play. And again, we started to dip our toes in that water with the Test Optional Means Test Optional campaign. But I can imagine, especially as the system is changing, for us to be able to sort of become that hub. So I do think we have a role to play.
Right. That is great to hear, and I know will be greatly appreciated. Well, so as I transition back to Susie here for a minute to find out if I missed any hyper important questions, let me first just say a huge thank you. This has been, frankly, a really fun conversation, but also a rich and insightful conversation, and we really, really appreciate you taking the time with us this morning.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, what a fantastic conversation. Thank you both for just the very informal conversation, your candor, Angel, for sure, and you know, just for being a leader in this space, especially in, as Stacy characterized it earlier, very interesting times that we're going through. I wanted to just wrap up and thank all of our attendees for joining us. We'll be following up with sending you the recording of this webinar. And if you're interested in learning more about the MTC, our website is mastery.org. Pretty simple. And you can find out on that website who to contact if you'd like to learn more about our work and the potential of membership. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you again, Stacy and Angel, and have a great day, everyone.